given we've had the week in Britain that we've just had. You're Jewish, you're from Manchester. Your reactions to the last week?
I mean, there's no other authentic reaction other than to say this has been horrific. I'm from the Jewish community. I grew up near the synagogue. I went to synagogue close to the area, and I went to school near the synagogue. And to see what happened, the terrorist attack on our soil, has been deeply both personal and political. At the same time, as a political leader and as an elected member of the London Assembly, some of the work I'm proudest of is interfaith work. And I'm also aware at the same time of the arson at the mosque last night. And I think all of these are reminders that when the forces around the right and the far right come for minority communities, they come for all of us. And actually, the most important response is solidarity.
What are your reactions to the Home Secretary's this morning proposals on the right to protest? I mean, she's talking about the idea of trying to give the police more powers to enforce some restrictions on repeated protests. Hard not to conclude, she denied this to me, but it's hard not to conclude that she's got the Gaza protests in mind with regards to this. What do you think of these proposals?
I think it's deeply irresponsible. I think it's looking to crush dissent. And actually, so I don't repeat too much what your listeners have just heard, I think Baroness Varsi spoke really fluently on this, that this cannot be about turning communities against each other. I've just talked about, as a Jewish man, how I feel about the terrorist attack. That's a completely different conversation to the same horror that I feel deeply to the genocide in Gaza. We know there's, on average, the equivalent of a classroom of children who are massacred every single day. Of course, it's not just children, it's adults too. And so many people in this country, increasingly so, are looking at our British government's role in this genocide and are wanting to go out on the streets in a non-violent way and march, something which has been a proud British tradition ever since we've had a democracy, from the suffragettes to the civil rights movement. And I think it speaks of a government that is losing control, a government that is terrified of being criticised, and a government that actually, or a leadership that knows it's on its way out. And so I'd call on the government and the Home Secretary to do the right thing, both in terms of stop selling arms to Israel and allow people to protest. There was a protest recently with pots and pans where people were protesting against the famine in Palestine. And actually the reason given by the police for stopping this protest was it might disturb businesses.
What do you think the British... something I asked the Home Secretary earlier was around this quite remarkable invitation from the Israeli government to Tommy Robinson, or an Israeli minister, to Tommy Robinson to go and speak in Israel, saying that he had been a defender, effectively, of British values against what they called as Islamic fascism or Islamism. What do you think the British government should do about that?
I think they should call it out. I think in the same way that we had 150,000 people march on the streets, and the Prime Minister didn't seem to do or say anything at all. In fact, his response was to change the rules around indefinite leave to remain. It wasn't just a dog whistle, it was practically a foghorn. Look, this is ultimately about leadership and how we speak to people in this country. And this was a moment of all moments for the Prime Minister to get the lectern out, to be outside Number 10, to have that moment of speaking to the country. Of
he called Farage a racist. Surely you'd welcome that? Or he said that the policy, I should say, was racist.
Well, he finally got there in the end, but he actually should have called Farage a racist. And I think it's about time we start to call people who and what they are. Now, that doesn't mean anyone voting for reform is necessarily a racist. It means that some racists, in fact, most racists, will be voting for reform. We need to have complexity and nuance in this conversation. But it just feels like the
since you mentioned, I mean, fair enough. I was going to come to this a bit later, but since you mentioned complexity and nuance, you've described Nigel Farage as a fascist. Now, fascism, the last time I checked, involved ultra-authoritarian nationalism, the suppression of dissent, a single-party state, a cult of personality, and the use of violence or paramilitarism to achieve its end. Which of those criteria would you say Nigel Farage satisfies?
I think most of them are on the way if you actually listen to the things that he's saying. Also,
what, a single-party state? He's not proposed to abolish British democracy. That's absurd.
Well, he's not yet, but also during Brexit, when you think about Take Back Control, some of the themes that were in there all seem to be speaking.
You think that Brexit was about the consolidation and the creation of a single-party state?
I think Brexit was ultimately about protecting the wealth of multimillionaires and billionaires.
Yeah, but that's different. No, you're changing the conversation there, Zack Polanski. I've just asked you about how you think Nigel Farage satisfies the criteria of fascism, one of which involves, a really key one, the creation of a single-party state. What has Nigel Farage said or done which would indicate any legitimacy to the idea that he's in favour of a single-party state?
Well, I was about to finish with what I was saying, which is when you have excess power in this country and wealth, which often come together, when that utilizes working class resentment, you don't have to be a historian to know there are many times in the history when that's exactly when fascism begins. Now, it does not begin, as people say, in jackboots. It doesn't begin always with militarism. It actually begins with the kind of rhetoric we're saying. So if you're asking me, is Nigel Farage in full-blown fascist rhetoric? Absolutely not. But if you actually listen, and Lewis, you're someone who listens very closely to the things he's saying, he's constantly echoing things that have happened in history. And by the way, in this conversation, Keir Starmer doesn't get off lightly either. If you're going to go on stage and quote Enoch Powell, now he says he didn't know that's what he was doing, or that's not what he meant. I don't believe that for a second.
But Zack Polanski, you're the one who said that we need to have more nuance and complexity in our conversations. And yet you're the one calling Nigel Farage a fascist. Not only do you call Nigel Farage a fascist, you said in your conference speech, accusing Labour politicians of, quote, being active participants in the murdering of Palestinians. So they're murderers, you think?
I think if you sell weapons and bombs that you know are raining on people day in and day out, then I think that's a war crime, and I think you should take responsibility.
So you're saying that that Labour politicians are murderers?
I'm saying that Labour politicians know exactly what they're doing when they vote, or when they are continuing not to condemn and not to vote against arms sales.
They've just recognised the Palestinian state. There's a highly, highly regulated regime, security regime, which you know is complicated because Israel have got difficult relations with some of its enemies, who, by the way, are also our enemies. And yet, despite that fact, you're calling them murderers. Don't you think that politicians ought to be a little bit more careful, you know, particularly in serious positions like yours as the leader of a political party, particularly given all of the political charge and political violence that we're seeing, about using language like fascism and murderers?
Despite the incredulity of your tone, I think anyone can see it is a basic, obvious fact. If you sell weapons to a country that the UN, many genocide scholars are saying are complicit, are active enabling in a genocide, then what I'm saying is complex, it is nuanced, but it's also pretty simple.
They're murderers. It doesn't sound very nuanced, that Polanski, that they're murderers. Well, that is not a nuanced statement.
If someone a weapon, if your actions give someone a weapon, and that weapon ends in the deaths of thousands, tens of thousands.
And you know it is a point of contestation where the British government denies that those weapons are being used in that genocide, as you put it. So it is more complicated. And you're the one who talks about complexity and nuance, and then you give a series of statements which aren't complex or nuanced at all.
Well, it's good that we're having a conversation so we can keep the complexity and we can keep the nuance. If you are selling fighter jet components, then it's just not believable when we're seeing this live stream, when we're seeing this genocide live streamed on our phones and our TVs, and we always get the answer that the IDF denies it. And Nick Maynard, a doctor, says in Palestine there are bullet wounds in ankles one day, in shoulders another day, in the testicles of teenage boys another day, and the only conclusion you can make is the IDF are using human beings as target practice.
So to keep, I mean, Farage, you say, is a fascist. To keep him out, which I know you've talked about that you would do at all costs, you'd presumably do a deal with Labour.
I would do anything I can to make sure Nigel Farage...
So you do a deal with a bunch of people you think are murderers?
Well, I think the fundamental thing we need to do is lower people's bills and change material living conditions.
Work with murderers. See, I don't think you really do believe they're murderers, because you wouldn't work with them if you thought they were.
Well, I wouldn't work with Keir Starmer, and I've said that several times. I think Keir Starmer has completely lost the trust of the British public, not just on the genocide, but on the two-child benefit cap, on disability benefits. Again, I don't think it's controversial. You can only look at polling to see how much this country is saying this Prime Minister is not standing for people in this country. So no, I wouldn't work with Keir Starmer, but I don't know who a future Labour leader is, and absolutely, we need, compromise is in the DNA of the Green Party. We want to work with other people. We want a better, more nuanced politics. And I don't think anything I've said in this interview has been unnuanced. I think actually very often, I'm not saying you're doing this, I'm saying more widely, in the media, these conversations are made to sound more complex than they are. But children, adults are dying every single day. And our country is selling weapons to the state that is killing those people. And so to say that that is a line that ends up in the murder of the people is not an absurd statement. I think it actually is just clearly a statement of truth.
Let's just briefly talk about some of the other policies and the other things you've been saying at your conference. I don't want to just talk with you about through the prism of other politicians. We're going to talk about your ideas. You've said that we will say it loud, migrants and refugees are welcome here. Is there any limit on the number of refugees and migrants you think should be welcome here?
Well, I think arbitrary limits have never worked, and actually migration is circular. I understand that people are concerned about the amount of people coming here, but as soon as you speak to them, their concerns are about the lack of council houses, the lack of investment in the National Health Service. The sense of this country is breaking, and all of those concerns are correct. We don't have enough council homes. The country isn't run properly, but none of those are the problems of migrants. Those are the problems of decades of conservative austerity and now Labour austerity. And actually, the answer
so you would welcome 100,000 refugees, 200,000 refugees, 300. You know as well as I do, there are millions of refugees around the world. But as far as you're concerned, the Green Party in England and Wales, there's no limit on the numbers. There's no limit to the capacity we might be able to absorb realistically.
Well, we don't even need to have an abstract conversation about this, because when Tony Blair said that he was going to open up the borders for migration, people came up with all sorts of scare numbers. But actually what happened is people came and people left. And that's how migration has always worked. Circular.
A lot of people came. 1 million people came from the EUA, and that led to Brexit partly.
Well, you have British people living all over the world. And actually, I think there will always be push and pull factors. But I don't think we should want to live in a country where people don't want to.
But you believe in local democracy, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what happens if local democracy says they're not welcome here?
Well, that's why we need to have leadership. And actually what we have is Donald Trump says something one day, Nigel Farage says it the next day, and then Keir Starmer.
No, it's got nothing to do with Farage. It's got nothing to do with them. I'm saying you're saying they're welcome. You're saying they're welcome here. You're saying they're welcome here, and I'm just saying to you, what happens if a local authority says they're not welcome here? Would Green ministers say no, you've got to have them? In which case, you don't really believe in local democracy, do you?
That's absurd. It's the same conversation where we build.
Literally happens all the time.
Well, ultimately, you need to have a more holistic conversation. So you need to be making sure that there is leadership from the top, which is talking about the fact that we have 150,000 vacancies in our National Health Service. Of course, we need to train British workers as well. But actually, ultimately, this is about making sure that those gaps that there are in our economy that need to be filled or have been filled by migrants, that work is still there.
You've said this week you think all drugs should be legalized, including crack cocaine and heroin. Do you know what happened in Oregon when that happened?
Yeah, I also know what happened in Portugal. And actually what I'm talking about is being legalized and regulated. Ultimately, the war on drugs has failed. It is killing people.
But just so the listeners know, because you know, I mean, obviously I've set that up, but I'm sure you know, but the listeners might not know. And you're right, there are other countries where different things have happened. But in Oregon, overdose deaths and visible drug use increased, treatment uptake was low, and last year the state legislature rolled back the decriminalisation. So we should be a bit worried about that, shouldn't we?
Well, I think there's lots of other things you need to do, which is why legalized and regulated is so important. Ultimately, if people have problematic relationships with drugs, then we need to make sure they have support, and that's led by the National Health Service. I want everyone to know that sometimes when you say this, people think this is encouraging people to take drugs. It's actually the opposite. It's saying if people are taking drugs, let's make sure that's transparent and actually people can get the support that they need if their relationship with drugs is problematic.
You proposed in your conference speech to take back into public ownership Britain's utilities and so on. Do you have an estimate for how much that might cost?
Well, if you look at something like Thames Water, the shareholders themselves are saying it's actually worth nothing. When we sold Thames Water, we sold it with £0 debt. There's now billions and billions of pounds of debt. They've gone to shareholders and CEOs. I think ultimately people in this country are outraged that water companies are pumping sewage into our waters and charging us extra for the privilege.
But well, obviously people will be outraged about that. But I mean, the IFS and others in the past, when this has come up, have estimated the cost would be around £200 billion. So where are we going to find £200 billion?
Well, I think this is about taking it in the round, and it's recognizing that ultimately we sold off these water companies. They weren't sold off with any debt. They now have this huge amount.
Sure, it's been a catastrophe, but it's just about how we get the money now to take it back into public ownership. It's a huge amount of money to find down the back of the sofa.
Well, I think we take it back rather than paying them back. A few small people in this country.
So forced nationalisation without compensation, state seizure.
Well, we're talking expropriation. Ultimately, what we're saying is a few small people in this country have taken our power, our wealth, and our assets.
So to be clear, because I think this is really important, Zack Polanski, and I think a lot of people will support you, but I just want to be absolutely clear. You would legislate to seize these assets by force.
If I was in government and able to make this decision, I'd have the full force of the civil service to go, let's look at the most logical and coherent way to do this.
No compensation for the shareholders, no compensation. And whatever impact that might have on investment and so on is in Britain as a destination for international investment.
Two separate questions. Why should a shareholder get some compensation when these things have been run so badly and everyone else in the country has picked up the bill? In terms of investment in this country, a lot of these assets are owned by foreign investors. It's the most unpatriotic thing possible. Let's bring our assets back into our public hands and make sure it works for our communities and everyone whose bills are far too high right now. Our standards of living are far too low. Let's turn that around because those are the results of political choices.
Do you think you could overtake Labour in the polls, Zack Polanski?
We've just taken them over in London in a poll that was commissioned yesterday or came out yesterday. First London, next
Should Keir Starmer be afraid of you?
He should be absolutely worried electorally about the Green Party. And I think he is already. I gave a speech on Friday. He put out a press statement within about 10 minutes accusing me of being divisive, despite the fact my whole speech was about kindness, compassion, bringing people together and communities. If the Prime Minister of this country or the Labour Party, the government of this country, are having to lie about a fellow party leader's speech, then you know they're rattled.